I'll leave this here. Sit back.
Welcome everyone to the 22nd Annual Bio CEO and Investor Conference. I am Narek Sagarian, Managing Director of Investor Relations and Programming here at Bio. Welcome to the Market Outlook, Market Performance and IPO Class of 2020 panel session. Visit the Bio Boulevard to learn more about Bio's new podcast featuring biotechnology breakthroughs, the global problems they solve, and the stories of patients whose lives have been changed forever by our work. You can also download our first annual Diversity and Inclusion Report at rightmixmatters.org. We'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the generous sponsors that support our conference. I'll also leave our disclosure statement on the screen for a moment. I would like to introduce the moderator for this session, John Vandermosten, Senior Biotechnology Analyst at Zacks Investment Research. Please join me in welcoming John.
All right. Very good. Well, as Narek mentioned, this is the market outlook for IPOs. We've had a pretty exciting year over the last year in 2019, and a lot of IPOs out there, especially when you look year over year. So first, I'd like to just get started with a short introduction from anyone on the panel and everyone on the panel. We've got Noel right here. Noel, why don't you kick us off with a little bit about yourself and what you work on?
Sure. Noel Brown. I'm a managing director with Cantor Fitzgerald in our investment banking group covering biotechnology. I'm with the firm for 4.5 years. We've been in finance in some way, shape, or form for 24 years, and excited to be back here with Bio.
Hi there, good afternoon. My name is Jorge Ramirez. I'm with HIG Capital. HIG is a very large, diversified private equity firm that across different middle market buyout strategies manages about $36 billion. We do have laser focus on healthcare, and healthcare represents about, or at least certainly the largest industry vertical in which we invest. We do also have a healthcare dedicated fund which invest in development stage opportunities, medical devices, therapeutics, diagnostics, as well as pharma-related strategies. So these are services where pharma is the ultimate customer, contract packaging, development, etc. We look to put about $20 to $25 million into a company over the life of the investment. These are companies that are private development stage, public development stage, as well as opportunities that we can look at that consider structured finance and royalty buyouts.
Hi, I'm Eric Goldstein, and I'm an equity research analyst with Mizuho Securities. I cover biotechnology, but also a variety of companies that are really focused in the oncology area, therapeutically speaking, oncology and hematology. And I've been at the firm for about a year, although been in the equity research business much longer. And we are building out our equity research world on the biopharmaceutical side, really looking at therapeutic areas given the tremendous amount of information and number of companies that are now available in the universe that didn't exist 10 or 15 years ago.
My name is Jeff Galvin. I'm the CEO of American Gene Technologies, and we are a gene and cell therapy drug developer with a cure for HIV that's going into the clinic this year. So I'm more on the other side of this panel, more looking at IPO opportunities and so forth. So that's my background.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Jim Capuccio from H.C. Wainwright. I'm a managing director in our investment banking group covering biotechnology therapeutics. Been in the biotech ecosystem since the late 90s on pretty much every side of the business. Started out as a junior banker, went into institutional sales for a number of years as a desk specialist, worked on the buy side as an analyst and portfolio manager and equity options derivative trader, and then moved back into banking when we relaunched H.C. Wainwright in 2013. Our firm is one of the largest underwriters of biotechnology deals. We are a healthcare specific shop, and I think most of you guys know we are last year we did over 200 transactions representing over $7.6 billion in capital. And year to date, we've done over 25 transactions representing $4.3 billion in capital.
And my name is John Vandermosten, Senior Biotech Analyst at Zacks Small Cap Research. And our group focuses on smaller cap names, usually under $1 billion, and we're trying to find names that haven't received the recognition they deserve on the street. I've been with the firm for about 4 years. Prior to that, I was a portfolio manager and analyst at some funds in Texas, including Texas Teachers, and also Westwood Group. So I'll get us started off with a few performance indicators. In 2019, the S&P 500 was up 31.5%, and the Renaissance IPO index rose 34.75%. So we saw a little bit out of performance there for IPOs, and that includes all IPOs, not just biotechs. Year to date, actually, performance has even been stronger for IPOs, with the index up 9% compared to the S&P 500 up 3%. Biotechs contributed favorably to this trend. So some of the IPOs out there that have really done well in the last weeks and months, Black Diamond, Beam, and Wrapped, they've driven this strong performance that we've seen. M&A, it's been another area of strength, with 28 deals taking place last year compared to about 16 in 2018 in the biotech space. So we've seen transactions not only on IPOs but also in M&A as well. Interest has been strong. However, there are some issues that are coming up. Coronavirus, it's been in the news pretty much every day for the last several weeks. There's an election on the horizon, and also, we aren't in the early stages of an economic expansion. So, even though things have been doing well and the market seems to want to push up no matter what's happening, there are some things to consider. And I'm going to start out with Mara. She's a fellow analyst, and I just want to get her thoughts on some of these clouds on the horizon. Are they clouds, or are they going to clear up and we're going to have a sunny day?
Well, I think you can look at two sides of a coin to some degree. So, to the extent you talk about coronavirus being a cloud, which it is, and there's obviously concern about what that means on a macro level and China's GDP and whatnot, it also opens up avenues of opportunities. I mean, Moderna just did, a $500 million follow-on offering based on, being able to rapidly take an asset into phase 1 testing for coronavirus. So I think you really have to look at the end of the day on sort of what the fundamentals are and what makes sense. We're always concerned in an election year because of headline risk, right? That's always an issue for healthcare stocks. But in reality, having tried to look back, and we did this exercise just recently, looking back over the last, 4 presidential cycles, and looking at different, parties in power and whether you had, gridlock in between Congress and between the executive branch, there's really no clear indicator. You do see, if anything, I could say maybe the market likes an incumbent. So for those of you hoping that we have an incumbent, it might be good for stocks. But having said that, I think that you really still have to focus on what the fundamentals are. Is there reasonable access to capital? We certainly are seeing that is the case. There still is a fair amount of cash in the biotech industry, in the publicly traded biotech industry today, and we certainly have had an environment where companies have been funded by larger raises. So I don't necessarily want to say like smooth sailing from here, but I think you have a good balance of, you have to be aware of these macro issues, but understand that we maybe have a stronger backdrop than we did, let's say, coming in in the early part of the decade.
I think the only thing I'd add to that is, as I was kind of reflecting on JP Morgan and the attitudes of, investors and company CEOs that are thinking about, how they're going to get their companies out, not really if they're going to get their companies out. I have to say there was a lot of enthusiasm. I talked to a lot of folks about, whether they thought that, clearly this was before coronavirus, but whether they thought that the election year was going to, or at least the volatility you would expect in an election year would keep them on the sidelines. But neither the bankers, nor the CEOs, nor the investors really seem to think twice about it, which is different from previous election year JP Morgans. So, at least the informal pulse that I had, from investors really in Europe and around the United States was really one of optimism and one where everybody is really looking to put some capital out.
Jim, you have a thought or anything else?
No, I was just going to add to that comment that I think in terms of our market outlook and conversations we've had with our community is, I'd add everything to your comments, but yet is the key thing. Come mid-year, I think once we understand what the dynamic looks like politically, we could have a risk-off environment, and we as a firm and many of our clients which represent the vast majority of capital that's out there, are looking at 2020 as a 6-month year at this point in time. So floodgates are open now. It's a great environment, but with the understanding that for planning purposes, most people are planning for a 6-month year. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that will hold true. We, like everyone else, reserve the right to adjust our forward-looking statements at any point in time, but that's the way we're looking at it right now.
Okay, great. All right, so as part of my prep for this, I was taking a look at all the IPOs and all the M&A that took place over the last year and a half, and so I was trying to find a few trends. The two that I found were deals taking place in the areas of gene therapy and precision oncology with mutations, and there's a lot of other areas too that were one-offs, but those were the two areas where I saw a lot of deals take place. So the question really is, will these trends continue in these therapeutic areas? Or these areas, and what will drive them? And Jeff, since you're in gene therapy, and that was one of the areas that has seen a lot of activity in the last year and a half, maybe we can start out with your thoughts on that.
Well, of course, I'm very bullish on the future of gene and cell therapy because it's such a disruptive technology, and the potential of it is so high. You're already seeing a drip of miracle cures coming out of the gene and cell therapy area that prove that it has the power to address things that were unaddressable and to cure things that were incurable. And will this continue? Absolutely. This is, high tech has come to drug development, so what it means is that it follows more of technology trends than in biotech trends. It's not a random discovery or having to create a huge number of drug candidates and screen them down to one or two that has a low probability of becoming a drug. What it is directed design, almost like software. And our ability to actually predict this, to build genetic constructs that can address all different types of diseases, and the tool set from which we can draw to start to address wider and wider disease areas is on an upslope that is really reminiscent of Moore's law of doubling every year. Meanwhile, the cost is doing the opposite. It's cutting in half every year. And what you have is an environment where it's just the opportunities are growing and growing and growing now. So how does this relate to future IPOs? Well, I think you're going to see more and more of them are going to be gene and cell therapy companies because that's where more of the blockbusters are going to come from. It's going to be disruptive to pharmaceuticals because gene and cell therapy could yield 1,000 blockbusters, not a handful. So how do you carry out the normal type of pharma model where you're a publisher of an acquirer of your strategic assets for biotech when you're looking at billion-dollar purchases and thousands of them coming down the pike. So pharma is going to find a new model for dealing with this deluge of products that are going to come. You're seeing the drip days. Trust me, in a year or two, you're going to be seeing a steady stream. And within 5 years, you're going to be seeing a deluge, and then the dam is going to break, and everything that you formerly believed about disease and about pharmaceuticals will break in a good way, because these solutions are actually quite economical because of the value that they bring to the patient. And that is why Goldman Sachs, has anybody heard of that company, is predicting a $5 trillion industry. So, drugs right now, pharmaceuticals is $1 trillion. I think that Goldman Sachs is underestimating the potential of this, but just the same, a 5X on it really has meaning in terms of our understanding of what will IPO, how we will look at companies and try to figure out when to IPO them, when pharma companies will look at them for M&A transactions, the whole, just normal development cycles of drugs are shortening and the costs are coming down dramatically, and this is going to mean a whole bunch of new calculus amongst analysts and amongst strategic partners, and it bodes well for the investor.
Any other observations on trends out there, things that are emerging or things that are waning? I mean, I've heard some commentary that IO is kind of on its way out, and maybe there's something else that's emerging, like CNS. No, didn't you mention?
Yeah, we had talked about that. So we're seeing, look, I mean, there's been increasing, and I think it was overdue, that CNS is becoming, at least sharing more of the spotlight than it has historically. On a very small end, I would say 46% of the IPOs in Q4 were CNS companies. Again, I mean, I think the total number was what, like 10 or something, so it's not like I got a huge sample set. But that is changing, right? And it's the breadth of CNS from neuropsych all the way through to neurodegenerative disease, where historically people took a view that it's impossible to develop in Parkinson's, it's impossible to develop in ALS or Alzheimer's, insert name of horrible neurodegenerative disease here. But there's been renewed hope and faith, I think. There's always been, I think, hope and faith among those who are developing, the researchers and the scientists and the drug development companies who want to see a therapy developed. But I think there's been a renewed patience, interest, and I think hope for a huge upside among the investment community, because these deals are getting done and getting done well with greater frequency than I've seen kind of in the past.
So if I could just add to that. So I think it's interesting because, if you look at the amount of newly committed capital in neuroscience, it really does say something about a sea change going on right now in that area, because it just, from the sheer number of molecules in development, oncology ranks 1, but CNS ranks number 2, and it's been that way for a long time. So the fact that we're seeing more companies able to tap into public markets in a bigger way certainly is suggestive of some type of mind change for investors.
And let me point out a few of the other areas that come back. We talked about NASH. Nobody wants to talk about NASH anymore. But their CAR T, that was quite popular, and it's kind of faded a little bit. Microbiome, combination approaches, platform technologies, and others. Any other thoughts on any of these other kind of areas and where we might be going with them?
Well, the all-encompassing terminology out there is, sexy science, precision medicine, true platforms, true engines, and again, that is great, and that's what drives innovation. And again, we've been in an innovation curve that's been largely funded fairly consistently for a very, very long time, and you're seeing a lot of those innovations really translate into cures in some cases or chronic treatment, which is great. But that's not to leave the less sexy stuff behind as well. And so I think what you saw with the class of 18, the IPO class of 18, is you saw a lot of sexy science that was maybe a little bit too early for the public markets. And as a result, that asset class is up about 30%. Where in 19, you saw a largely more mature IPO class. And as a group, that class has returned close to 80%. So it's a striking difference within the 1 year. And as we go into 2020, we're seeing similar trends that, investors saying, I want to see the newest, greatest, most cutting edge science. But I also want to understand, is it feasible to manufacture? How are you going to commercialize it? And a lot of the questions that weren't asked before. And as we think about things like gene therapy, and as we think about a disruptive model to pharma, pharma is clearly thinking about this. I think Audentes' acquisition is probably the most striking view into the future. I mean, they built a huge, manufacturing facility in South San Francisco that was one of the key assets for that acquisition, beyond just the therapeutic platform.
Okay. Yeah, and I want to explore a little bit more of that idea of the science driving driving the interest in the IPOs and the performance and all of that, rather than things like coronavirus. So, any other thoughts on the science and kind of where it's been, with the cycles in the space of being 10 to 15 years from first getting into the clinic to being approved? Things that we did a decade and a half ago are what's coming to fruition now. So, any thoughts on the science and where the science has been done and where we might see it in the next few years?
I mean, I might take a shot at a very 10,000 foot level perspective. And I would say generally the world, this sphere, this sort of market is getting smarter, like much smarter. Not me, but everybody else on this sofa, all of you out there are getting smarter, because, when I think back to late 90s and going around with a quote unquote life sciences company, biotech was still kind of burgeoning. It didn't take a whole lot to impress a portfolio manager, right? Because oftentimes the person was a generalist. They'd have looked at some PC company the day before, and then perhaps they looked at some other kind of technology, and now you're coming up with quote unquote biotech. And we ended up with things like proteomics companies, right, demanding $400 million market caps when all they had were a bunch of servers in a room and were trying to impress you with like the breadth of their computing power. And look, we were impressed, but there was no there, right? I mean, it was great kind of fundamental, elemental type stuff going on, but not therapeutics yet. And what I'm impressed by, the point that James was making, some of the companies in 2018, while they were earlier than those that were coming in 2019, they were quantum leaps ahead of where the companies were in like 1999 and 2000s. Like, we're really seeing real companies. And I think the investors have evolved, right? Because again, we were seeing these generalists who had sort of a leaning towards all things funky and science. There's now MD PhDs everywhere. It seems like everybody and their cousins becoming an MD PhD. And so the bar has now become higher for companies who are going to present to these investors about what their value add is. The bar has moved up on the analysts as well, because now you're having to provide, right? And Mara and I used to work together twice over, we were reminded. She's now having to provide even higher level of intel and insight to those folks who kind of have and you as well, that already have a sort of a strong view because of their science background.
I just hire smarter people to help me, that's all.
But you're forced to now, whereas back in the day, you could get by with some random kid.
But I will say, that's true, that's how I got started in business. But I will say that, to your point, there's two things that I would just like to add. I used to joke around about being a sell-side analyst. It was like having a pop quiz every day, because anybody can ask you anything and you have to have an answer for it, and hopefully you were correct. But the volume of information today is so much greater than it was 5 and 10 and 15 and 20 years ago, because the breadth of companies are different. So I think we're seeing a couple dynamics at the same time. One is that the science to some degree is getting more exciting and sexier, and it's a continual process. But we also are seeing sort of a little bit of a glut, and we haven't gone yet from all of that sort of developmental to clinical science. So I look at cell therapy in this way, and I do focus a lot on oncology. So it's not just about CAR T, it's all the different cellular therapy approaches. They all look really exciting and fascinating and wonderful, but there's not a lot of differentiation yet between what actually is really going to be truly innovative upon what we already have today, other than what we know to be CAR T. So it's just something to think about as we continue down the spectrum.
And to add to that, to Mara's point, not only do you have more volumes of information, but you have more volumes of information on a dramatically bigger universe. So we're almost 700 publicly traded biotechnology companies. And I think when all of us probably started in this industry, if you were $1 billion market cap company, everyone knew your lead program, your second, your third, your fifth, your 10th program, every inflection point you're going to have. We have at Wainwright, billion, billion and a half, $3 billion companies that we take to the buy side, they've never heard of them. And it really is a stark change that you have to go out there and compete against 600 other companies in terms of garnering investor attention. And it is very hard to differentiate yourself, especially when you're talking about scientific concept as opposed to clinical results.
So if I can add something, like I said, I'm different than the rest of the people on this panel. They're really experts at analyzing different opportunities. But I'll give you sort of my gut impression from having been a technologist for the last 45 years. So what I think is happening right now in biotech is a gene boom. It's very much like the .com boom. I think what you're going to see is there's going to be a huge number of companies that come to the forefront and get offered in IPOs. And one of the major differences in round one of the .com boom versus round one of the .gene boom is that because of the good science that we have here on the couch and in all of these brokerage firms and investment banks, you're not going to get real empty shirts. There will be a model to take a successful development to commercialization and return a really good uptick on the IPO price. So everything won't go off the cliff because these guys are telling you, well, each eyeball on the site is worth $2,000, and that's how we value these things now. No, they're really diving into the science, and so everything is really prepared to make sure that companies that can succeed will be offered, but they won't be guaranteed to succeed because it is complex science, and some of them will make it and some of them won't. A much higher percentage of them will make it than traditional biotech, because drugs in this industry are much less like molecules and much more like software. They're viral vectors containing series of nucleotides that reprogram your DNA to change the pathology of a cell and correct a defect. Now, just because you have an excellent theory doesn't mean it's going to work, but if you get in there and you get some efficacy data, you're probably going to debug your way to an approval. And you will become commercial, or you will be eaten up by a giant pharma company that needs to keep on adding assets to their pipeline. Otherwise, they could become irrelevant as drugs that are their monopolies become obsolete, right? Immuno-oncology, let's talk about that. I think we will see in the next 10 to 15 years the end of terminal cancers. What does that mean for Avastin? Right? So the pharma companies are going to be in there buying up assets at earlier and earlier stages because they're going to have to backfill, the things that are going to either go off the cliff, and I don't think it's going to be necessary for these assets to go off the cliff anymore, or that are just going to be obsoleted by better drugs that have such a higher level of efficacy that it doesn't matter that it's 5 times the price because you're getting 50 times the value. And so, I think that's, where a lot of the growth in this market will go. So what does the future look like in my mind? So you've dot-com boom version 1.0. You're going to get more companies that aren't going to be successful in that boom, and some of them will crap out. And then you're going to get a disappointment cycle, and then you're going to get a rebirth of this industry with companies that really understand gene and cell therapy, that have experience, that know how to debug things before they go into the clinic and not waste $100 million a month debugging a hemophilia solution, right? Because they went into the clinic too early. Instead, they're going to find tests at the bench that are going to anticipate a lot of the potential stumbling blocks and landmines that you get in the clinic, and they're going to raise the certainty, the predictability of these things in the clinic, and you're going to get, instead of your Broadcom, offerings, you're going to get your Googles and your Facebooks, right, of this industry. In other words, you're going to have people that really understand the technology. It's going to be more of a technology play and less of a market play. Because if I cure liver cancer, well, everybody's going to buy my product. It's not there's no other option out there. Your two choices are to buy or die. I mean, it is essentially the fundamental aspect of the pharmaceutical industry. But the difference will be this, and this is a very important thing to remember, that in software, there are many ways to do the same thing. So this will remain a competitive industry. So they aren't going to be charging these outrageous prices for the drugs because that's going to make them vulnerable to somebody else coming in. And remember what I said. This is a technology curve. You've got a doubling of capability and a halving of the cost every single year. And what that means is really good things for the consumer. It means high competition and an increase in value that is exponential. It puts things like this in the hands of Central Africa, right? Because the value is so high and the cost is now manageable. They wouldn't have bought a mini computer. They didn't even have a phone, a lot of these people. This is the future of therapeutics. You're going to see waves of this. You're going to see overexuberance in this market, followed by disappointment, followed by a real capture of a model that really works, followed by, a recession and, or something like that will drag the values down again. And then you're going to see that this is fundamental to your life, that you will be making decisions about, do I get the new cell phone? And in the future, this is way off because they're not going to allow you to do cosmetic things with gene and cell therapy out of the FDA right now. It'll be about, can I afford to cure my monogenic disease and to not have to take a pill every day or whatever. The reason that we're curing HIV is because those people take a pill every day that makes them feel sick. And it's better than dying, but it's a lifetime of, a decreased quality of life. So they'll buy a fix, a one and done fix that makes them immune for life. That'll have really, really high value in your life. But ultimately you'll be deciding, is it better to look good or to feel good? And you'll be foregoing that Lamborghini because you're going to be getting something that's going to make your hair 20 years old, your skin 20 years old, and your ability to build muscle 20 years old. And that is the 50-year outlook on this. And this is why it just never stops. So gene and cell therapy, we're finally tweaking with everything that makes you. And there's a limited number of things that we can do safely and effectively now, but the future of that is unlimited. It's like looking at a teletype and saying, wow, computers are eventually going to drive our cars. And of course, when you were, back in the mini computer days, nobody would believe that, but if you really were a visionary in this industry, you would see that sensor technology was progressing, these robotics was progressing, and computing was progressing in a way where the future was unlimited. And the future of computers is still unlimited, but the future of gene and cell therapy is going to look a lot like that in 30 years. So this is a long-term trend.
And I agree with that just from a technological perspective, but from a therapeutic, like a true drug development perspective, I don't see the parallels as strong, because at the end of the day, like in tech, you can make chips for faster, better, cheaper, whatever the phrase is, but drug development still costs what it costs, right? You still got to run a trial. And the trial.
Let me debate that with you.
Sure.
Okay. So let's take a typical gene and cell therapy drug goes into a phase 1 of 15 patients, and what's making it expensive now is that the vectors that are being used can cost tens of millions of dollars to do that study, because you need to put $2 million worth of vector into each patient. You know how much vector we put into an HIV patient to cure them? Or not into the patient, but into the cells? 25,000. All right? You can get efficiency in a lot of different ways. When you understand the technology, you get efficiencies from it. There's also a drop in price of manufacturing. There's going to be new vectors that are actually able to carry more cargo and infect more cells more reliably that'll also drive the cost down. Now let's talk about the regulatory side, because what makes the $2.1 billion pill? The FDA, right? It's the cost of a phase 3, really.
And that's actually the second half of my question.
Oh, okay. Then should I not?
No, well, half of it is the science.
Yeah.
And the other half is getting approved by the FDA. And
But let me explain why the costs are coming down there as well.
Let's talk about the trends there and where we are in terms of the FDA approval and the cycle. Sometimes they're less likely to approve, and sometimes they're more likely to approve. And how will the FDA stance right now affect the outlook for not only gene therapy but everything?
So is it okay if I continue on that exact
Yeah.
question? So when we went out to propose the HIV cure, one of the things that we told the pre-IND review board, which was the who's who of PhDs, and that's important to remember, because our lead scientific advisor, Bob Redfield, who now heads the CDC, during the break, he told us, this is an incredible team that you're talking to on the other side there. These are really smart people in this science. And guess what their response was to one of the things that we posited? We said, we don't need to do tox studies. And they had an initial negative reaction. How could you believe that? We said, well, our process is so parallel to CAR T, except we're doing less cells and a much less toxic modification that doesn't even change the behavior of the T cell, and it reinfusing less cells. So if there was going to be any toxicities, wouldn't you have seen it on 6,000 CAR T patients? It only took them a minute and a half to agree to that. No tox studies. So every experiment in gene and cell therapy relates to every other experiment in gene and cell therapy. If you are good at writing Microsoft Word, guess what? You're already good at writing Microsoft Excel. And there's a lot of things that just hold true between one product and another. If you've done a monogenic disease and you've been able to show that the lentiviral vector distributes in a certain way, and you can now count on that, and the FDA counts on it because they've seen it before, and you don't have to repeat it. And so, what's happening to the regulatory process is it's becoming less of a barrier to entry. It won't be driving the drug prices, and it won't be preventing competition that is a benefit to the most efficient drug developers, and to the patients, and to the whole healthcare industry, which is really suffering from this barrier to entry, preventing innovation. Now, the issue now at the FDA is this. There's 900 INDs in gene and cell therapy sitting on the desks of FDA reviewers. That team that talked to us is so busy that we don't even have a chance of getting them on our review. What we get are people that are still interns at the FDA reviewing our proposal. So what does that mean? They're not letting it slide by, it's the opposite. So now we see a little bit of impediment because of an underfunded FDA that's overwhelmed. And so in order for those people to get comfort that they won't let through the next thalidomide, right? They have to go down a whole bunch of rules that they don't fully understand because they haven't been there for 10 years. And they need to match that against a technology that they don't understand because by its very nature, it's cutting edge and very few people understand it fully. So, I think what we're going to see is the lowering of cost. I think that.
So what would you project would be the development cycle for your therapy?
I think the typical monogenic disease will be $20 million to approval. Now tell me that any company in the world can't raise that, right? I raised $40 million, I have no investment banks, I have no VCs, I have no, the bottom line is that we're getting, at $40 million, we have a IP portfolio in this, what was all white space. We were able to grab it because nobody else was competing for this.
But you're saying $20 million, you're gonna get FDA approval.
Yes.
And then you're gonna price your drug at $20 a therapy? I mean,
no, we're gonna price it at the market, right?
Well, why'd you price at the market if you got everything done so much cheaper?
I don't know. I mean, when was the last time you saw a company price at based on cost rather than on, you justify based on cost, right? We'll go down to K Street, right, and we'll go, oh,
but you spoke about all this cost reduction. I'm trying to see how that flows through the system.
I think it will flow through the system. It'll make this industry competitive, which will force us to moderate our pricing, because if we go ahead and charge something outrageous for any one of these drugs, somebody else will just go ahead and do it on a different vector. There are multiple software, just because you were the first person that wrote the spreadsheet. Look at VisiCalc. Where the heck is that, right? They got wiped out by Lotus. Who wiped out Lotus? Microsoft. Why did Microsoft wipe out Lotus? Because Microsoft was the most efficient software developer. So if they picked a strategic area, they certainly had some fair and unfair advantages because they actually had the tool set internally. So they understood it better than people, and they also leveraged it in an anti-competitive way against other companies. That's for other people to judge. But the bottom line is this: efficiency ruled that market. Excel is the only thing you guys use out there, right? Why isn't the price $10,000 instead of $300? I'll tell you why. Because you'd move to Linux. All right, there is competition out there. There's lots of alternatives. It's all about pricing that is, keeping the prices moderate. When we come out,
I get you like kind of at a 10,000 foot level.
yeah.
But I caution people when they compare a highly regulated industry like what we're in with a completely virtually unregulated industry like software.
Look, I think that it's an interesting discussion, but at the end of the day, you have to put your technology into a human body, and that is a very, the dynamic issues that are associated with that, as opposed to loading up the platform and seeing worlds apart.
Right.
So,
No one dies from Excel crashing.
So
No one dies from
I've got some analysts at my shop that might think the different.
okay, so
manufacturing is everything in cell and gene therapy. If you're seeing top dollar acquisitions because of the complexity, it's not something that you can outsource long term. I mean, we see that as one of the biggest barriers to investment is, okay guys, this looks great, your data looks great, your platform looks great, where's your manufacturing? Oh, well, we're contracting it here, there, we have batch to batch variability, we moved a machine from here to here 10 feet, and now we have to basically recertify our entire process with FDA. I mean, Noel and Mara, we see this literally on a daily basis. So, maybe as a 30-year curve thing, this would be great, and I love the optimism.
it may take longer.
Optimism in this industry is the only thing keeping us alive, so it's great to see it. But again, if we're talking sort of, back to class of 2020, I think we have to be a little more grounded maybe in our expectations.
Well, hey, I got a question list, and we're going to get through it. So, let me kick off on another topic here. So I did a little analysis, and actually Jim did a little analysis too on performance. I found the median return of the biotech IPOs over the last year and month. About 35% was the median of the 60+ deals that I saw. Ranged from a 93% loss from Guardian Health to over 500% return for Karuna Therapeutics. And I want to ask the panel, and Jorge, you and I talked about this a little bit, but what are successful IPOs doing to generate really strong returns? And conversely, what are poorly performing IPOs doing? That range from -93 plus 500, there's got to be some activities that
I was sure that's directed at Jorge first. I mean, every deal stands on its own merits, right? You know, some people try to, ride an innovation curve or ride a trend, or, again, we saw it this week, coronavirus, people are very successful on that. But at the end of the day, there's a passionate group of people behind every single company, and the way they feel about their company, the way they design their company, the way they design their programs, that all plays into how successful the company is. The people that have created value over the last year have largely done it before, and that's probably, we did a huge analysis of insider ownership, validating investors, stage of development. I mean, we looked at every possible number you could look at to say what makes an IPO work versus what makes an IPO not work. And unfortunately for my team that did it, God bless them, they were up for weeks doing this, there was no correlation. And the best we could come up with was guys that have done it before are likely to replicate their success. Guys that haven't done it before, well, everyone's got to start somewhere, and they're going to surround themselves with smart people that have done it before. And that's really the deciding factor, at least in our experience.
I'd have to agree 100%. It's odd, right? Because it does defy. You would expect there to be some trend, some kind of correlation, but it really has come down to, those who have done it before have a greater propensity to succeed because they kind of know how to get it done. But they're also able to attract capital in ways that those who have not yet done it before can, right? There are some who just literally hang on a shingle and say, hey, I'm doing it again. And the money just kind of flows in, right? Before you even have an idea sometimes. And so it's amazing when you see that.
One aspect that I saw, maybe you can comment on this, is just the ability of crossover investors to make a difference. There was some analysis done that I read through that showed that actually played a favorable role in terms of performance after that year. Jorge, did you want to weave, or Amara, you want to weave some of that into an answer?
Well, it's interesting. I think the subject of crossover investors and successful IPOs, the data will show, I believe, that having crossover investors tends to see IPOs priced at higher valuations. But interestingly, crossover investors don't stay around as long as other investors. So, it's something that every company is going to have to judge for themselves.
I think that's absolutely right. As we think about building the book for an IPO, we always start, thinking about the crossover investor and the extent to which insiders are going to support the IPO, the crossover investors are going to support the IPO, and coming to market with a book that's, at least fully allocated, so we can at least talk about allocations. So, there's no question that we think about who we're going to build the book with, and recognizing that every company really is the sum of its milestones. You've got to come out at a time where it's not going to be dead money. You've got to come out at a time where you're going to have something interesting to say over the course of the next 6 to 12 months. Otherwise, no one's really going to be that interested. Or the folks that might be interested, there's going to be kind of other issues at play. So, in terms of the real fundamentals, for that I would totally agree.
There's also a market backdrop aspect to that. So as you go into an election year, and again, history shows us, believe it or not, that actually election years are usually pretty good years in terms of overall stock market performance. But there are times, and again, this goes back to being on the buy side, there are times where you don't want to be awake every single night worrying about your book. You don't want to worry about binary event risk. And sometimes finding, a type of story that out there that has, good technology, but a lack of inflection points for the foreseeable future is not necessarily a bad thing, assuming they're fully funded. And it all has to do with market backdrop. When the financing risk of a company is low because markets are doing great, then fine. That you don't worry about that. But when markets get tricky and when markets get volatile, and you have a fully funded company, you don't necessarily always want binary risk. You don't always need that inflection point. And again, it hasn't proven out in recent history because the markets have been so robust. But again, you go back to 2008, pre-2008. Again, we're with a universe of investors that haven't necessarily lived through some of the volatility we've seen, back in the late 90s when we were all starting out and cutting our teeth in this industry.
All right, well, I want to give the audience a chance to ask a few questions if you have any. So there's a microphone right there. Probably you should use that so we can all hear you. But please go ahead.
Yeah, I have to actually commend Dean as your actually helping evaluation, but also my background. I mean, I have to commend Mr. Jeff Galvin on this one. Basically, because I've been in the clinical research. I started in the clinical research, and I moved over to the commercializations, and I worked with the high end, the higher end of the chain, the executives and the venture analysts. But the issue, I think, is the changing paradigm in the clinical trials right now is starting to look forward to patient engagement and to advocacy and to looking at the actual, cell-based therapy is one of the leading indicators of that. And like he said, in terms of vectors, because I have experience in working with some of these folks in the cell gene therapy, it's hard to gain the money from the venture analysts and because they don't understand the paradigm. And the $1 billion, $2 billion research is not going to be sustainable anymore. It's truly changing. It's changing quickly. So if the analysts and the industry starts to pick up on that quicker, this will change the paradigm in a faster pace.
Did you have a question or?
It's a comment with a question, but the question is, again, venture analysts and the world of venture analysts, the protocols of the way they look at valuing these companies, they're not evaluating it from the full spectrum. Or is that not true as a general comment? From clinical trials, from the regulatory environment, that is rapidly changing.
If I could just jump in for a second. First of all, thank you very much. It was very nice to get a supportive comment out of the audience. I feel outnumbered up here by people that are, technicians in a very important industry, which is sort of gaming the financial system and understanding winners and losers and picking the winners, right? So I would trust them before I would trust me in the short term. But in the long term, I would trust me. I've been through all of these different technologies, and the internet was just a fad until it was the hottest thing on earth. And believe me, it takes time for all technicians who are used to a particular paradigm to sort of, realize what's going on around them and to action it. And we're seeing this with the FDA right now. But the FDA has not been able to keep up with the pace of this technology, and that's a negative in the industry. I think that, what I'm saying here doesn't change anything short term. The companies that are going to get offered are going to be the companies that gain confidence with the institutional investors. Once we show things like a $20 million approval, which I think we will show within the next 10 years, then the analysts will expect it. And they'll, compare to those types of metrics. So, I was at Apple Computer where, when the whole industry told us, look, the Apple computer is a toy and it will never go anywhere. It's basically going to stay that way. And now PCs have wiped out all of the mainframe companies. Where's Sperry Univac and Burroughs? IBM just installs PCs now. They don't really do anything else. So, disruptive technologies are not, that is the domain of visionaries like Steve Jobs, right? That's not the domain of analysts and regulators. Regulation, I think, will come down, and the reason being is that like I said, these things become more and more predictable. You'll be able to simulate these things in silico And computers are also rising to that challenge. And so the FDA will be able to say, here's the safety heat map, and we don't need you to test everything, but here's a hotspot, you need to prove this, here's a hotspot, you need to prove this. And that's going to go in favor of deterministic sciences where you're designing a drug as opposed to discovering a drug or generating a random molecule and screening a drug. And and it goes all over the body. Remember, gene and cell therapy, the key to gene and cell therapy is targeting. When we put a drug in you, we can decide where it goes and we can decide where it turns on. Why do most drugs fail? Off-target effect in healthy tissue. And gene and cell therapy, the whole trend of this is to better targeting and sparing all tissue except for the diseased tissue from treatment, and re-regulating exact pathways in the cell that determine everything about how the cell behaves. Whether it's in vivo or ex vivo cell therapy, the reality is the same, that this has attributes that are going to allow regulators to say, we've seen this before, we don't need to see it again. It isn't going to happen overnight. I mean, I didn't mean to say that, look, drop all your pharmaceutical stocks and buy AGT. No, it's not like that at all. This is a 30-year thing. But driving your car is a deadly thing. And computers are going to get there now, right? Not quite as fast as Elon Musk would have us believe, but it will get there, I guarantee you. But yes, there's danger in everything. This has a special consideration because we're talking about people's health. But I think that we're going into an era where we're going to gain more and more comfort with this, and that's going to bring the costs down as well.
And I'd also add that we already as an industry had a tremendous amount of success because the fact that we can be up here on a stage, on a sofa, talking about gene therapy, not in some dark skunk works, because 15 years ago, frankly, you couldn't, right? When we forget, this era of gene therapies aren't the first. I mean, we already had them. There was a horrible, unrelated, unfortunate death, right, which then drove that technology, that whole field of research into hiding. And people didn't scrounge and hustle to get grant money, we wouldn't be where we are today. So I would commend the industry for having been open-minded from learning, right, about gene therapy, realizing its strength, and I frankly say we've come a long way. I know there's still a long way to go, and I believe like long-term there's going to be a great curve, but I look from where we were, say, when was that, 25 years ago? Yeah. Right. And it took us to now, 20 years later, to be in a position where we can openly talk about developing another cell therapy. Because I tell you, like in 2008, it wasn't like cell therapy, like gene therapy went away. You just couldn't talk about it publicly. No investor wanted to give you a quarter for that, right? It's too deadly, it's too dangerous, you're gonna alter the whole human genome.
Can I mention one thing about that? It still goes down to the same part of human nature, which is irrational exuberance over something that's sexy, right? And so the difference was it was the scientists that were irrational and people died. And the FDA wasn't experienced enough to know exactly what they needed to limit. And so, yes, the irrational exuberance resulted in deaths instead of a lot of bad investments. But these are cycles that human beings go through. And I think you're absolutely right to point out that gene therapy 1.0 was in the 90s. And it died because of irrational exuberance causing a really, really high-profile failure that people emotionally connected to. Maybe not a lot of people lost money, but I'll tell you that institutional investors lost money, pharma companies lost money. A lot of the most important people to rebirth this industry were monumentally disappointed. And but yes, it's coming back. It's ready for prime time. It's safer. We've got 7 approved drugs now to look at. And so I think it's an exciting future for this. But I don't think we've even seen the end of, sort of these disappointments. We're going to see more of them.
It's all cyclical. We want to at least get one more question in from the audience. Anybody else have something to ask the panelists? Okay. Oh, okay. You see that the iPad had a question here.
While he's looking on the iPad, just one thing to note for the class of 2020. So far, the group is up as an asset class 40%, which I think is a great start to the year, and we're hoping that continues for everyone.
All right, so I hope I'm going to ask the right thing here. So from Peter, Do you see the IPO class of 2020 creating value post-IPO? Have the IPO classes of previous years IPO created value post-IPO?
I promise I couldn't read. My eyes aren't that good. Yeah, I mean, they're you know, the average performance again is up 40%. Some of them are actually outperforming as well. So, you know, the class is off to a great start.
Anybody else? Let's see what else. Anybody want to ask one from the microphone? Okay, well, let me ask one final question. So here's something that I think about a lot. I frequently make the argument that biotech companies of the future are going to have to get drugs approved quicker, more cheaply, and then faster. They're going to have to get it through the regulatory process faster. How do these three elements play a role in investor interest, M&A, and the attractiveness of IPOs? Can I get a comment from each of you on that? And again, the three factors are get it through the regulatory process faster, higher probability of success because they are quite low, and then also do it less expensively.
Hello? Yeah, so, you know, I think over the last maybe 5 to 10 years, I think we've seen that trend. You know, I, as an investor, worry a lot less about getting through FDA than I do about how this drug is actually going to compete. So, you know, when we're looking at medical devices and we're looking at therapeutic products, you know, hitting your primary endpoint is necessary but not sufficient. You know, we think a lot about it, and we probably, whereas 10 years ago, you know, as a proportion of diligence, reimbursement, and, you know, talking to commercial plans, talking to Medicare, and spending a ton of time with folks in Washington that have their ears to the ground on exactly what's happening, was probably 1%. I would say we probably spend now 50% of our time thinking about whether or not and at what level this drug or this device or this therapy is going to get reimbursed at. So I think gone are the days where getting a drug approved is the ultimate value creating milestone, although it will always be important, especially as you have an eye towards M&A. But any M&A buyer is going to look at this drug and think the same thing. What price can I pay today based on what my assumptions are about what level this therapy is going to get reimbursed? So, you know, there's no question that drugs and clinical trials, you know, everyone's thinking about adaptive designs and, you know, how can we get to demonstrate some sort of clinical benefit early and quickly for the regulators, but it's not until the payers weigh in on their thoughts about clinical value, their thoughts about how much they'd be willing to pay given what clinical value or what efficiency, you know, this drug or therapy brings to the overall system. So there's much more, or at least our view is much broader than it ever has been with respect to M&A and with respect to getting anything from the FDA.
I was going to just say, I think that is a very largely correct mindset out there among investors, because if you think about it, gone are the days where you had 1 or 2 monoclonal antibodies out in the market, and they were truly unique and truly novel and treating diseases that were previously untreatable. So now, if you think about just the sheer volume of drugs that have moved on, I think it's something like the top 15 molecules, money-making molecules, are, you know, high-tech drugs that no longer sort of single chemical synthesis type drugs. And so it does change from an investor perspective, you know, what is the terminal value of that, and how do I get that into my valuation, see if I can, you know, benefit from that.
Yeah, so going back to the original question about, you know, optimizing the cost of development, I wish we had a statistician up here. Because at the end of the day, let's remember why we have 3 phases of clinical development. Phase 1 is a safety trial. We have been conditioned to expect efficacy out of safety trials. And that's great when you're talking about targeted therapies, and again, this goes to everything you know, Jeff was talking about earlier, but at the end of the day, the vast majority of molecules, of drugs, of therapeutics have to be safe, number 1. Once we get through safety, we then try to find target engagement, proof of concept. Okay? And why are we doing that? Well, because we're going to run a decent-sized phase 3, and we need statistical assumptions to power that phase 3. And so, again, looking back over 20-plus year background in the industry, there are many times, and the saying holds true, where the drug fails the trial, not the trial. The drug fails the trial. statistical design failed the drug. And again, we've been conditioned as investors to say, okay, phase one's gonna be a huge inflection point because we're gonna get a great signal, we can do breakthrough designation, we can do a small phase two, and we can be on the market very quickly. By and far, that has not played out unless it was orphan disease or some sort of niche market out there. And at the end of the day, you need to power your trials so that they're going to succeed. And if you look at where investor dollars go, they don't necessarily reward efficiency, they reward success. And if success means having a fully funded clinical program, that's where you're going to get your marquee investors. Where you try to bootstrap and shortcut and kind of eat things by, those are the business plans that we don't see get funded consistently.
All of this is so very true. It's like talking to myself. But it sounds so much better when it comes out of you guys and not in my own head. We also see this reflected in what we kind of view as critical milestones, right? Because if you think back to try and remember 2002, right? Maybe it's more like 2005. And somebody says, oh yeah, I'm talking to the FDA, we got SPA. SPA, huge value inflection point. Stocks are running up on what? Get an agreement around what your design is going to be.
An agreement to review, not an agreement to approve.
Right. But we got so jazzed and excited. Then it was like, then I realized, that's not really a thing. Go over it. And then now you start to think about, you see companies that then get successful phase threes, and the stocks get pounded. And why? Yes, they had a huge success. I mean, this thing is ultimately likely going to get approved. But let's say that now people become skeptical on approval. Well, even on approval, stocks are getting hammered. And part of it all comes back to what Jorge was saying, is how is somebody going to pay for it? And the presumption is among investors, short the launch, right? If I'm going to try and make some quick money, I'm going to presume it's going to be tougher than nails to get this thing commercialized. They're not going to do as well as they expect they will do because it does defy rationality. Yes, people should be on that therapy, but guess what? Hospitals, doctors, patients just don't move that quickly. And so you end up with this sort of dislocation of what should be happening versus what is expected to happen. And I think by default happens because we expected it to happen, right? So people are both shorting with their positions and they're shorting it emotionally, almost philosophically. There's a presumption that this thing's going to fail on the launch.
Well, statistically, all those things are true, though, right? So they're actually making smart decisions and tactical decisions and technical reading of the stock. I think that the word value is used two different ways. One is when something creates financial value. Another one is when it creates market value. I think there's going to be a closer and closer association with those in the future and a shorter time frame between them and more visibility. And, just to take, for instance, monogenic loss of function disorders. The total market is $2 to $4 trillion a year in palliative treatment for 7,000 diseases. And I know it's hard to accept that these things may get approved in $20 million, but the phase one is going away in gene and cell therapy. We're never allowed to give a gene or cell therapy to a healthy patient. There's not the traditional dose escalation curves of the past. And so you do get a readout in phase one. And there's a higher percentage of successes between the petri dish, the mouse, and the phase one and the phase two. And you guys will all build that into your models once it's established statistically. And the phase two, a lot of the drugs that you're seeing were licensed out of pivotal phase two. So gene and cell therapy, it'll be common that you will go ahead and do a 15-patient phase one. You'll get better than 50% of these people recovering. Then you're going to have a phase two where you'll do 35 to 50 patients, and that'll be good enough for a disease that has 1,000 patients in the United States because the advocacy organizations are going to be screaming for it, and it won't be considered dangerous because there'll be enough drugs before it where they'll have some statistical basis to say we're not going too far out on a limb by approving it out of a pivotal phase two. So I think things are just changing. I think that not only are you guys getting a good read on what is true today, but you're getting a good read and perspective on what was true yesterday. And I think that you'll continue, and the whole industry and all of the smart investors will continue to stay up to date on as the